All right. Shall I start? Um, okay, great. Hi, welcome everyone. This is the Tech and Society Salon discussion series that Stop hosts. Today we're going to be speaking about Stop Cop City. This is a discussion specifically examining the surveillance, intimidation, and criminalization tactics used against Stop Cop City organizers, activists, and allies. And we're going to try to center the certain practices and resistance strategies that are being adopted by the movement, and all those fighting to prevent the deforestation of the Weelaunee Forest and the construction of a police military training facility. Joining us today, we have Nicholas Fesette. Nicholas Fesette is an assistant professor of theater at Emory University's Oxford College. He researches how performances, theatrical and mediatized, can contribute to resistant, liberatory, and abolitionist movements such as Stop Cop City, and also how performance has historically served to support and circulate carceral logics by appealing to the white imagination. His writing is published in the volume Race and Performance After Repetition, as well as in a variety of peer-reviewed journals. And his current book project, Performance After Policing, Abolition Dramaturgies in Carceral America, examines the carceral state as a performing structure that continually restages race and class oppression. In part, this research draws upon 5 years' work as a teaching artist in the Auburn Correctional Facility, a maximum security men's prison in upstate New York, where he helped facilitate a collective of incarcerated writers and performers, the Phoenix Players Theater Group. I am Sarah Roth. I'm the associate, the communications and advocacy associate at STOP, and I'm joining this Zoom from Brooklyn, New York, which occupies the unceded homeland of the Lenape people. Colonial settlers and federal policies perpetrated genocide, forced migration, and violent oppression that pushed the Lenape west and north to rebuild their nations in the areas now known as Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario. STOP acknowledges today's Lenape communities and supports their movements to reestablish their presence on their ancestral lands. So before we kick off today's discussion about the Stop Cop City movement, the movement to defend the Atlanta forest, I wanted to first acknowledge forest defender Manuel Duran, also known as Tortuguita. It's their chosen forest name. Tort was killed a year and a day ago by Georgia cops while sitting with hands raised in a tent in the Weelaunee Forest. Tort was described by fellow activists as a radiant, joyful, and beloved community member who brought an indescribable jubilance to each and every moment of their life and fought tirelessly to honor and protect the sacred land of the Weelaunee Forest. That was a year and a day ago. So I'm gonna kick it off to you, Nick, just to sort of ask for first a description of the Stop Cop City movement, sort of what it's about, what they are fighting against, what is Cop City, sort of just like a broad overview.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. First, I want to thank you and thank Stop for inviting me to speak. I also want to further thank you for the acknowledgement of the anniversary of the murder of Tortuguita, which I think is a really powerful reminder of what's at stake in this conversation and related conversations about surveillance, about forms of social control that I know Stop is deeply concerned and involved in. And then I'll also, before I give a sort of overview about how I understand Stop Cop City, I'll offer my own land acknowledgement because I'm speaking to you from my home in South Decatur, And so this acknowledgement is adapted from language that was generated at my employer, Emory University's, with input from indigenous scholars and activists at Emory. So Emory was founded on the historic lands of the Muskogee Creek Nation 15 years after settlers forced the Muskogee out of their land, which includes both of the Emory campuses, the main campus in the city and the campus where I teach, which is about 30 minutes east of the city in Oxford. And it also includes my home where I am right now. And I also want to acknowledge Emory's founders were slaveholders, and that the Oxford campus where I teach and where I work, the building where my office is was constructed by enslaved people. And so to these peoples and their descendants, I want to acknowledge the grave injustices inflicted on them. And I want to recognize the mark of their labor and the creation of the university. And I further want to move from land acknowledgement, from this sort of acknowledgement to actions like Stop Cop City, in supporting Muskogee descendants today, and in general in striving against U.S. white supremacy. And I just said before I talk more about Stop Cop City, I think for this conversation, land acknowledgements are super important and pressing for the ethical reasons, but also because the topics we're talking about are really in a kind of like essential way about our relationship to the land, to nature, to plants, to the history of the land, to the animals that live there, and trees that have been cut down to make way for strengthening police power. And we're talking a lot about how we in this country tend to prioritize building police power instead of empowering our connection to the natural world and to the land, to our precious natural land. So what is Cop City? So I think I'll give a gloss just to make sure, in case you're unfamiliar with it, give you some sense of what it is and sort of introduce the conversation this way. So the Cop City, so South River or Weelaunee Forest is home to a proposed $90 million Atlanta Public Safety Training Center. That's the sort of official name for it. And activists have called this training facility Cop City. And I'll get into why we call it that in a moment. So this facility was originally proposed, and it passed Atlanta City Council in 2021, and it's gone up before the council a few times since then for budgeting reasons, and it has started construction. They've raised about 85 acres of forest. They did that in 2023. This facility is planned to go on the site of what used to be a plantation and then was a city prison farm where incarcerated people were exploited, their labor was exploited, and they were sort of brutalized in this site. And the forest, the South River Forest, where this is located, is really butts up right against neighborhoods. This is a kind of densely populated residential area near Gresham Park. And so the plan is they've already sort of raised all these acres, and then they're going to build this training facility, which will include a mock city block, and it will include like a track for doing sort of automobile training or something, right? And it's all these shooting range and a bunch of other sort of facilities that are all sort of directed towards training cops in urban warfare tactics. So just since 2021, when the Atlanta City Council first passed this, there's been a sort of concerted, a decentralized but concerted effort on the part of locals, on the part of community organizers, on the part of activists and protesters to combat this plan, which is abhorrent for the environmental destruction that this is causing, but also for what seems like an especially grotesque expansion of police power, especially in the wake of high-profile police killings of people like George Floyd, of Rayshard Brooks here in Atlanta, of Breonna Taylor, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So in the wake of those killings, the plans for this facility sort of arise as a kind of direct response to the calls to defund the police. Instead, now there's this call to superfund the police with facilities like this. So the site, as I said, they've already raised 85 acres, but the whole site is actually near 400 acres. They're planning it's a 381 acre site. It's already received tens of millions of dollars in corporate and municipal funds, and undemocratic approval from political leaders, the mayors, the previous mayor and the current mayor, like I said, Atlanta City Council, and lots of business people. What else might be important to share? A couple more important things I want to highlight. So initially, the facility was said to require $30 million of public money, and then the rest of the money was going to be private money. This past June, you may have seen in the news, there was another Atlanta City Council meeting where the main topic of conversation was to improve an additional 30-something million dollars. So the total amount of public money sort of doubled in the course of just under 2 years, right, to $67 million of taxpayers' money to fund this facility. And so in the future, activists are already sort of wondering and questioning how much more money is this facility going to cost us. That Atlanta City Council meeting, that June 5th meeting, like I said, it set records. The public came out in full force, en masse, to voice their opposition to this facility, and hundreds of people spoke. They spoke for, I think, 15 hours, hundreds of speakers got up and voiced their opposition to this. And still the Atlanta City Council voted 11-4 to approve the funds. The final thing I'll say in this sort of general intro is the other sort of activist efforts to delay this project and fight this project. So we've talked about Tortuguita a little bit. We've gestured. They are what's known as a forest defender, which are a group of direct action protesters who camp in the forest and put their bodies on the line to prevent the raising of the trees and the construction of the building. There are other sorts of more conventional protests, and there was also last year a petition to put a referendum on the ballot this year in November to ask the people directly through electoral processes, do you want this facility to be built? And organizers, electoral-minded organizers, put together over 100,000 signatures, gathered over 100,000 signatures on this petition and filed it. And that's still sort of in a kind of limbo place as to whether the city will accept those signatures and whether a referendum will be on the ballot. So in conclusion, there's a variety of ways that, like, organizers, protesters, activists, mutual aid bail fund workers, what's really marking the Stop Cop City movement and making it seem like a special moment in anti-carceral and abolitionist protest is it's a decentralized, autonomous, diverse, multifaceted movement that uses lots and lots of different strategies to one purpose, which is prevent the building of this facility and to hopefully restore the forest to what it once was.
Thank you for that background. As you mentioned, that it seems that sort of strategies that might involve like appealing to legal system or electoral processes are not really listened to by Georgia lawmakers. I read an article that stated that the majority of freedom of information requests into the surveillance and policing tactics that are being used on forest defenders are largely stymied. I'm just curious what it is like for people involved in this movement right now, if they feel hopeless, like they cannot trust, these sort of systems, and sort of what alternatives they are coming up with.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I don't think that the vibe in Atlanta is one of hopelessness. I think abolitionist Mariam Kaba's advice that hope is a discipline is sort of taken very seriously by activists and organizers and others who are working against Cop City. I think all that being said, as you're sort of alluding to, there are like a range of tactics that are kind of unprecedented on the part of local, state, and federal authorities to criminalize and repress dissent. In this case, it really is kind of an unprecedented set of repressive measures. Well, I mean, it's unprecedented in the specific formations they're using. They've been used against civil rights and social justice movements for decades. A lot of the tactics that the mayor is using or the police are using here, right? And it sort of all boils down to building a narrative about this political movement, Stop Cop City or Block Cop City or Defend the Atlantic Forest, building a narrative around it that it is not representative of people who live in Atlanta, that it is the result of outside agitators, that it's the result of dangerous anarchists and et cetera, right? I mean, just categorically, that narrative, as was the case for previous social justice movements and previous civil rights movements, that narrative is just categorically false. This is arising organically and autonomously in a decentralized way from the people of Atlanta who overwhelmingly don't want this training facility to be built. And so there are, like I said, there are like different levels of repression that occur, and a lot of them are mobilized by police and the courts. I'll talk about those in a minute, but I just want to sort of jump aside and say, even at my own institution at Emory, repression against Stop Cop City sentiment against the movement is quite fierce. Last April, students led a Stop Cop City protest on the quad of the main campus. And this was I, I'm gonna say this, and it might sound derogatory, but I mean it in a sort of fun way. It was kind of a poster making, you know. It was a moment to gather and be together and um, eat and make posters, like I said, and make art and hang out and like um, chant and sing and voice and express dissent, do a performance, a social performance of dissent. And what happened was, as the night went on, a group of students decided that they were going to camp on the quad, and Emory administrators called Atlanta police on them, not campus police. They called the Atlanta police on them, and Atlanta police vacated the, I mean, very easily vacated the quad. I don't think anyone was arrested, but they showed up with a show of force in such a way that it intimidated students into leaving the quad. Um, and this has been written about. If you can access the Chronicle of Higher Education, they published a big piece on this last week. Faculty and students have all spoken out against this action, and we're sort of in the midst of trying to figure out uh, uh, what to do about it. But this is like sort of, at least in my life, like a very local, personal example of the kind of repression that the movement faces in general. I mean, this sort of repression happens on other college campuses in the area and across the country. But the most serious form of criminalization that Stop Cop City has faced, it occurred sort of the end of the last year when the state it, the state had been arresting people, has been arresting people since 2021, and has been charging people with a range of offenses. I'm not a legal scholar, so I'm sure there's a more proper word, but a range of crimes, and including domestic terrorism, which is kind of a ridiculous charge. And then at the end of this year, they charged 61 people with racketeering, with RICO. You may have read about this. This sort of made national news because it's a case where 61 protesters, people who voiced their opinion, their view, were charged with organized crime. Basically, it's sort of on its face ridiculous, and so they're facing up to 20 years in prison for. And you can find the indictment online. It's 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 over 100-page indictment, and you can see the sorts of things that Chris Carr, the Georgia district attorney, alleges that these 61 people did. And there are things like passing out flyers. There are things like being in the forest. Most sort of scandalous to me is in the indictment things like donating to mutual funds, like providing money to our neighbors and community members and our friends. These things are listed ad nauseum in the indictment in a kind of shocking way, as like examples of criminal conspiracy. Amounts of money, and we're talking amounts of money like as low as $12, are listed in this indictment as examples of conspiracy to incite. Who knows? And what we see is like this criminalization of mutual aid and this criminalization of dissent. It's everyone, I think, sort of knows that this doesn't actually deter crime. It's not a deterrence to social harm. It's a deterrence to participation in a democracy. It's deterrence to helping your neighbor. It's deterrence to raising your voice. It mostly criminalizes mutual aid. It criminalizes collective organization of people, and it criminalizes helping people. I mean, other things were sort of mentioned in the indictment that are as signs of criminal conspiracy, like memorizing the number of the mutual aid fund. There's the Atlanta Solidarity Fund. The three people who ran that, whose labor mostly ran that, they were arrested. charged with RICO, charged with domestic terrorism. And this is a type of fund that exists across the country. It's a bail bond fund for people to it's a form of mutual aid where people gather resources. So if someone's arrested at a protest, they can make bail or they can be supported with other sorts of legal support. And so the state not only arrested the people who ran that, but also has indicted others um, on the suspicion that they memorized the number, right? As if this is a sign of some kind of um, nefarious intent. Um, so I think in order to put this indictment together, like investigate, I don't really know where they got this information. I think they looked I mean, some of the evidence they used is like blog posts, you know, I think.
Mm,
Uh,
I wanted to revisit the idea or what you had mentioned about the criminalization of associations. It appeared that a majority of the arrest warrants um, for domestic terrorism charges, didn't involve any use of violence and use of force, and the majority of them were, citing protected speech, association, um, and so I was curious, what are ways that so these charges are, how are these charges being brought against uh, allies and forest defenders? Are police um, seeking this information, these associations, through digital connections, how people organize online, uh, photographs, their body worn cameras, um, things like that.
yeah, I'm not sure I can totally answer with 100% certainty about how the state gathers its information. But like I said, I mean, organizers, because this is a decentralized movement, because this is sort of autonomous movement, a lot of organization does occur online on various platforms, and these platforms are named in the indictment as like signs of criminal conspiracy, right? And that's kind of they're necessary to the state's case because, like you said, there's very little, like there's some destruction of property, right? That occurred, that allegedly occurred, I should say. But most of the meat of the indictment is like communications, is based on how people gathered and spoke with each other. Blog posts, there's multiple references in the indictment to a couple blogs. There are some witnesses who were non-indicted, um, but this is what I do want to say in relation to this question is like it's one of the, I think, strengths of this movement and one of the powers of this movement, and why I think it will ultimately prevail in some form is because the decentralization, the indictment, Chris Carr, the DA, repeatedly refers to an organization he calls Defend the Atlanta Forest. This organization doesn't exist. There's no umbrella organization that is overseeing um, uh, some sort of concerted domestic terrorist activity or something. That's all big fiction. It doesn't. It's not real. It's just a group of individuals, a set of individuals who are all separately but as a collective directed towards one political movement. And this is the strength of it, I think. I and so that's why a lot of the evidence, at least to my eyes, I'm not a lawyer, but to my eyes, a lot of the evidence in the indictment seems thin and is based on, I read this thing online that this person said, right, or is based on they were reimbursed $15 for kitchen supplies, which is clearly a sign of incitement. I'm not. That's not hyperbole. That is like there are dozens of lines in the indictment that are like so and so is was reimbursed $40 for um, cooking tools, clearly a sign to incite, right? It's fascinating, but it's also deeply troubling, because it's sort of, the implication is that any kind of activity that has a certain political ideology, namely anti-carceral, anti-cop city, any activity, whether it's on social media or in person or anything, can be subject to criminalization in this way.
Yeah, so I see it's this effort on behalf of law enforcement to group together, draw connections in order to place a label and criminal intent behind it. I just want to talk about then now allied movements, I guess, so around the country, and how police and government, federal government agencies are going after groups that are not in Atlanta.
Yeah, this is great. This is a great opportunity for me to talk about another to talk about the genocide in Palestine, right? Which allied movement is almost understates it. The word ally, because the issue of Cop City and the issue of the Israeli settler state and of the genocide of Palestinians are directly and materially related in Georgia, but elsewhere in the country as well. In Georgia, there's this program called GILEE, which is an acronym for Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, which is housed in Georgia State University. Again, universities sort of acting as locuses of carceral power. And this international law enforcement exchange, GILEE, brings Georgia police to Israel to train in urban warfare tactics, and the exact sort of tactics that Cop City is going to expand here domestically. Cops go there, and then also IDF forces come here to Georgia, and it's sort of like an international exchange of carceral militaristic power. And so, I mean, Cop City is, we might compare it to Little Gaza, right? Which is another sort of mock city, a little mock block, a little mock area for police to train in crowd control, in other sort of in bringing death to people, really. And so these movements are allied, but they're also, I mean, lots of organizers who were Stop Cop City organizers have very deftly and for the reasons that I said, incorporated Palestinian resistance into their movement here in Atlanta for these reasons.
Yeah, I had wondered about that just due to the passage of Section 702, the reauthorization of Section 702 in the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, whether sort of that communication and that not even, as you said, it goes beyond solidarity between movements, but like a whole connected movement. Communications between organizers and people, just trying to understand and speak and raise an awareness about movements. When it's connected to this international participation in genocide of Gazans, and the deeming of Palestinians as foreign terrorists. It's it seems that it's almost, a perfect combination of circumstances for FBI to be able to access these communications that are working to um, uh, defund and uh, sort of uh, end policing practices as we know them today.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think you're alluding to a story that Mother Jones reported about. So Stop Cop City, right? As I mean, uh, if you've heard about it, you may have heard about it because there are movements in cities across the country. Because if your city is not already Cop City, there's going to be a Cop City there. Um, uh, they're planning one, right? And so in Chicago, there was a solidarity Cop City event planned that the FBI surveilled. They in like um, old fashioned is the wrong word, but like in a decades old uh, spying practice of embedding a cop into. I mean, I think it was into a bookstore where this event was happening, in order to report um, on the event in some way. And this is just on its face, to me, a repression of just what you're saying, of abolitionist, anti-carceral, sort of radical leftist, um, and maybe not even that radical, just like a general sort of like, we don't need more police, um, maybe we need to protect the trees sort of sentiment. There's sort of at a federal level how solidarity itself, as I sort of said, uh, it has been criminalized or is being criminalized in Atlanta as we speak. Right? If mutual aid is criminalized, then solidarity, if you express any sort of shared struggle, then you may be subject to criminalization. Uh, uh, yeah,
I'd like to touch on sort of how you know forest defenders and organizers and connected movements with the criminalization of organization and sorry, as you said, collaboration and these movements. How are they finding? How are people involved in this movement finding resilience, subverting and challenging this repression of associations, and how are they countering these police narratives that are um, being that they're being assigned?
yeah. I think the first way that I'll think about this question is like to highlight, um, and this touches on maybe what we were talking about earlier regarding hopelessness and hope. Right? Is I wanted to sort of highlight some victories. Right? Um, because while the Atlanta City Council is sort of continually votes to approve um, this, funding for this facility, and while we'll see whether the referendum ends up on the ballot, and then who knows how the referendum will go. Right? There have been victories. The biggest victory is that 2 years ago, when they first proposed the facility, they said it would be done by now. They said that Cop City would be built by now. And guess what? It isn't. They cut down trees, that's true, but that facility is nowhere near being open. And so delaying substantially, that's a tremendous victory for this movement. I mean, and that is, I mean, it's driven by community organizers, but that's also, it's a sign of the value of direct action here in Atlanta. Like, this movement has been driven by the forest defenders, the people who are putting their bodies on the line, and they have, in that respect, been tremendously successful. And there's some other victories too, that I'll just spout off really quick. the original contractor, Reeves Young, they pulled out of the project, right? This glass company that another contractor, the subsequent contractor, hired, they pulled out of the project. Atlas Technical Consultants, they pulled out of the project. And they called like all the organizers. I don't know if I can curse on this, but they called them fucking annoying, right? I mean, it is like to me, even though it can feel, I mean, it's a being subject to that repression and that criminalization is frightening, and it can be it can perhaps lead to feelings of depression and burnout and all this. There are still like tremendous victories, and people and organizations and movement leaders are still doing the work. They're simultaneously agitating against Cop City, and they're agitating in support and solidarity with Palestinian resistance. And I think that there's a lot to feel. There's a lot about that I think is at least affectively, emotionally worthy and I don't know, gratifying, I guess is the word I'm looking for. And if people, I mean, there's lots of ways wherever you are. If you're not in Atlanta, there's lots of ways to get involved. If you visit stopcopcitysolidarity.org, that's like gives you like a bunch of targets, local targets for you to focus on. But there are also a range of Instagram accounts you can follow of movement of leaders in the movement who you can follow here, like Community Movement Builders or Demilitarize ATL, or the Atlanta Press Collective, Atlanta Community Press Collective, or Scalawag is a great magazine, or WRFG Independent Radio. ATL Radical Arts is an organization that I try to work with, and yeah, so despite and maybe because of that criminalization, that unprecedented criminalization, there's lots of energy and there's lots of power in this movement still.
Yeah. Oh, enormous wins and enormous bravery. I wanna leave some time for any audience questions. So if you are participating in this webinar, feel free to type your questions into the chat if you have any. And while we wait for that, Nick, I wanted to ask if there was, anything that we didn't cover in this discussion so far that you'd wish to bring up.
I'm gonna indulge myself. I mean, there's a bunch of like pieces that if people want to learn more, I might recommend them to read. So I'm gonna throw that out, and then I'll also indulge myself in like, because there may be a question about like, what is a theater scholar? What does that have to do with this? And so I maybe talk about that. But first, like, there's a great N+1 piece by oh, let me just look. I don't want to get the authors' names wrong. It's called Not One Tree. It's by Grace Glass and Sasha Tycho. That's a great like ethnographic piece about agitating in the forest directly. It's an ethnography of being a forest defender that is really fantastic. Scalawag magazine did like a week of writings on Stop Cop City from people like Micah Herskind, who's a abolitionist here, and following the work of Kamau Franklin and Deshaun Harrison and Mary Hooks. Like that, these are all like people that I suggest that if you're interested, you should check out their work more. But yeah, I mean, in closing, like, so what does a theater scholar have to do? Have to say about this is, I view Cop City. I view so much of police power and police training as spectacle. and I mean that in a theatrical sense, like as a show, as a narrative that is being performed for our benefit, to tell us a story about ourselves that is not does not have any essential truth, right? Um, we sometimes call this like propaganda. We sometimes call it like a crime panic. Um, we sometimes have other names for it, but it boils down to a kind of play that uh, officials like the Atlanta mayor Andre Dickens are like putting on to do something in the world. Um, and I think because of that, that also, at least for me, and maybe it's just because I'm a theater guy, like gives me um, a sense of power, a sense of empowerment, right? Because if it's just a story, if it's just a play, if it's not real, then that means it can obviously be changed, and we can obviously find the truth, and we can find a more real connection with each other, and with the world. Um, yeah.
Sort of on that note, about um, policing sort of being like the rule of law being used in this way, and the very abusive um, use of power. Is there like someone in the chat is asking if there's any way, any suggestions that you have for future actions to keep in mind to mitigate risks? I guess I want to tack on my question to that is just, in the situation where we have police really using an unprecedented level of repression, um, is it possible to mitigate these risks of arrest and violence?
There's I'm gonna hesitate. I'm gonna totally decline to. I won't answer the question simply, the question in the Q&A simply, right? Because I don't want to give like straight up advice about how political movements, like I said, the strength of this movement is its decentralization, is its diversity of tactics, is that there are people teaching about it, there are people writing about it, there are people camping in the forest, there are people posting on social media. It has there are people agitating electorally, right? There are people making posters and art, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Doing Stop Cop City trivia nights, um, uh, all kinds of things. And I think that really is and some of those, the unspoken thing here, some of those are riskier in different ways, right? Some of those involve a good amount of physical risk, and some of them involve risks to career. Some of them involve other sort of risks. And I think that in this moment, the state has demonstrated, at least from my point of view, the state has demonstrated that any form of protest, no matter if you're making posters and you're showing up, if it's children, right? The Highlander School here is a daycare, and they are deeply um, involved in teaching the kids about being involved in the Stop Cop City movement, which involves like protests with toddlers. Um, Even if those sorts of protests are deemed as a kind of violence by the state, as a kind of um, unwelcome agitation, a form of unwelcome political speech, then I think you sort of alluded to this, Sarah. I don't think there is a riskless form of speech in this regard. Andre Dickens tweeted. I know we can't call it tweeting anymore, or whatever, but he tweeted. He's the mayor of Atlanta. He tweeted, "If you don't support," I'm paraphrasing, or I'm botching the quote, but if you don't support this, then you have to get out of the way, or you'll face consequences. Or it was a sort of vague threat against a mass movement of dissent. And if even raising your voice is criminalized, if giving someone $12 is criminalized, then I sort of think there may be no way to um, evade that risk, and instead you have to negotiate with what level of risk um, you have the capacity for negotiating. I hope that addresses the question.
Um, Definitely does for me. Thank you for that question.
Yes, thank you.
Um, and if there are no other questions, I'd like to say thank you so much for joining us, Nick. This was, um, I thank you so much. I'm very grateful to have had this conversation with you. It was very enlightening.
Thanks again for having me.
Of course. Um, I'll stop the recording now, or will